I'm suggesting that putting a symbolic black square around your Instagram is not the same as taking on the fight for justice.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
This is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Claire Fox. Claire Fox is a writer and a journalist. She's also a former Brexit Party MEP and a former member of the Revolutionary Communist Party. We're going to be talking all about the cultural revolution that's going on in our society right now, the rise of the radical left, and also a bit about Claire Fox's background as someone who comes from the left. Thank you so much for joining us, Claire Fox.
It's good to be here.
So what's your overall impression of how our culture and society is changing at the moment? Are we going in the right direction?
No, sadly. I think that the recent events, particularly in relation to the reaction to the, terrible, brutal killing of one guy in America, George Floyd, initially showed that there was a real shock and a resonance for people being outraged at injustice that's very quickly and rapidly turned into a full-blown culture war, not just in America, but actually internationally and, in our society more so. It hasn't come out of nowhere. That's the problem. The problem is that for the last 10, 15 years, the identity politics has really dominated increasing numbers of institutions. This idea that you are defined by, natural factors such as your skin color or your gender, or the idea that you are somebody who's uniquely oppressed, the kind of victim politics. That's been brewing for a long time. And I've been following it in universities, and a lot of people just thought it was confined to the university sector. But in fact, it's become a major feature in most institutions. And now what's happened is it's been given a popular airing because people have seen what the consequences are. So sadly, rather than this turning into a possible moment where you would reflect on injustice and anyone who was worried about racism might be inclined to want to get involved, this has become a very one-dimensional, only one narrative allowed attempt at promoting a particular view of people. And the main narrative at the moment, as we know, is white privilege. The idea that our destiny is determined by our skin colour, a terribly regressive place to have arrived at.
So can you break down some of the other beliefs of this new woke movement? Where are they coming from? What are their core values?
Yeah, so one mistake that sometimes happens is that people think the problem is the Black Lives Matters organisation. Now, there's a lot to be said about the Black Lives Matters organisation, and in fact, a lot of people in the media have been looking into it. And if you look at their particular demands, they appear to be preposterous or very wild or whatever, what have you. But that isn't really what has resonated. I think to break it down, the argument that's being put forward is that modern society is inherently biased against particular minority groups. And in this instance, we're talking about racism. I mean, we could be talking about a number of different movements. We could be talking about women's rights, but let's concentrate in this instance on the particulars around Black Lives Matters with a small, not the organisation, but the general trend. And that argument goes that everything in society should be seen through the prism of racial difference. And this is a really big change from the Martin Luther King I Had a Dream vision, which emphasized that what the aim of those original civil rights activists and anti-racists was that you would be colorblind, that you would judge people on their characters, what was in their hearts, not on the superficial issue of skin color. Now we're in a situation where it's quite confidently asserted that Martin Luther King's vision is actually itself racist, that not seeing people's skin color means that you don't understand the particular suffering of particular groups. Now, it's really difficult because I would say, the vast majority of people in this country are not bigots. right? They're not racists. So if somebody tells you that in order to be an anti-racist, you have to go along with this, it effectively puts them in a situation whereby they can't speak frankly about the fact that they want to say things like, but, you know, in my area, there's an awful lot of poor white people, right? There's, you know, how can you have white privilege if you're a white homeless person? Or is Black Lives Matters a divisive slogan if then when somebody says all lives matters, they get sacked from their job, or they get disciplined, or they get called a racist for noting something that seems much more of a unifying demand? That's not to say that there aren't racist attitudes. God, I mean, one only has to look at my timeline as somebody who's declared myself an anti-racist to see that there's people with some pretty vile views. Of course, that's always been true. But the presumption is the vast majority of white people are inherently, unconsciously not aware of the fact that they are really bigoted. And that is such a mean-spirited view of ordinary people. It creates a sense of utter bewilderment, because it basically says it doesn't matter whether you think you are a racist or not, you really are. And so those attitudes have become very divisive, because people then start to feel, you know, that if you're going to ever explain the rise of something like white identity politics and white nationalism, it's actually those people who emphasize identity as the key driver of everything. So that's one thing. I suppose the other thing, just to note at this point, and you can break it down if you want, is that a lot of established institutions over the last 10 to 15 years have been really led by and bought into a lot of these ideas. So, you know, it might sound like a very minor area to worry about, but if you look at the debates in museums, now you wouldn't necessarily, you know, you might just go to a museum, you might not know that behind the scenes there's been this raging debate about, amongst museums leaders and experts and curators, saying, oh my God, although we're a museum showing off all of these important artifacts historically, maybe we're guilty as the colonial era of stealing these things, and oh dear, should we hand them back, and maybe we're too white an organization, and maybe we have to have diversity politics, and all of these things have been going on. So as soon as this has recent events have erupted into the scene, that trend has really speeded up. And the really disconcerting thing is the way that education and cultural institutions have almost now mandated their staff to buy into this notion of white privilege, and white fragility is the new phrase based on a book that's out in America that's a bestseller, which effectively says that white people are inherently racist and need to go on re-education courses in order to become aware of their own bigotry. Now, when you find that school head teachers are sending that out to parents and telling them that they should show their children, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds, show them videos and read the books that are associated with this politics, there's been no kickback against it. It's been bought into, which I think shows that at the heart of a lot of institutions is a real inability to defend themselves as institutions, a real anxiety about their own privilege. And in order to prove that they are on the right side of history and that they're anti-racist, they go along with this without even having read the books they're recommending everyone else reads, and really kind of pushing it out. And it becomes propaganda, and quite scary, because if you resist it, you can get labelled a racist. And who wants that when you're not a racist, to have that label thrown at you?
Well, this is the really interesting point, and I want to follow up on that last point about, you know, a lot of people feel that they have to support Black Lives Matter or put out these statements about, you know, white fragility or whatever it is, because they want to be seen as being on the right side of history, or they want to be seen as being on the, you know, the morally acceptable side of things. What, you know, surely if there's only two choices, you're racist or you're anti-racist, you would want to be on the anti-racist side. And you've come from this, you've got an interesting background in that you've come from the political left. It's usually people on the right who are criticising this movement and the woke movement, but obviously you've come from the left. And from my kind of naive perspective, and I want to get your views on this. A lot of the reasons behind people who are mainly on the left who support these Black Lives Matter movement and the things that we've been talking about comes from a place of just wanting to feel good and wanting to feel that I'm part of the new civil rights movement. And if you've been taught, I suppose, that everything is racist and everything is sexist, then you feel that it suddenly becomes your goal in life to become the new civil rights activist, to become the new Martin Luther King. So do you think that's where it comes from, sort of this kind of moral, feeling of moral superiority?
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, I want people to want to be anti-racist, but I agree with you that if your choices are you're a racist or you're an anti-racist, this is hardly a choice. And it effectively closes down any options. But the main thing is that anti-racism isn't one thing. What is it that we are being told we have to sign up to? I mean, the historic struggles of anti-racists were to overcome the barriers that were put in people's way because of their ethnicity. And at the moment, we're being told that the UK is no different than it was under times of slavery and colonialism, and that history has been flattened out, and that therefore you have to remove statues from a particular period. And if you were to say, but I don't think that statue is part of a racist conspiracy to hold down people of different ethnicities, just a statue, it's a historic monument, you are told that you are an apologist for slavery. I mean, how ridiculous is that? And so you're forcing people into extremes in a way, because people then say, well, if you're saying I'm a racist because I don't think Churchill's statue should be defaced, maybe I'm a racist then. I don't think I am, but where am I to go? For young, aspiring anti-racists, I think that they are in danger of insulting the gains of anti-racism historically. So we have to be historically specific. And even when I was growing up, because I'm old, when I was growing up, racism was an explicit and institutionalized affair. I mean, there was no doubt about it. There was a considerable discrimination against people because of their color. I mean, you couldn't, and organized groups of racists who beat people up because they were black. That was quite common. When I was living in Coventry around the time of the special, say, there was sort of big demonstrations. There was a very large national front. There was big gangs of racists, and there was, those of us who were involved in fighting that, right, and taking it up and so on. And we were doing that, white, black, Asian, everybody we took that on. And there was legislative changes made. There was a real change in culture, a massive attitudinal change happened, and institutions did actually start to have a different view. So are we just saying that didn't matter, that all of those things, and those were not based on identity politics? That was based on politics. It was politically, do you think there should be barriers to people because of their colour? We've now got a situation where maybe young people feel, it's not entirely generational, but there is an element of this. Young activists perfectly reasonably want to do the right thing. I'm suggesting that putting a symbolic black square around your Instagram is not the same as taking on the fight for justice. It is not. It is misunderstanding the nature, because it reduces everything to my attitudes are good, your attitudes are bad. It's not actually about anything material. It's not about changing society. It's basically saying that racism is almost a subjective matter. So it's no longer taking on. So when they say we want institutional racism to be tackled, they then mean we want to have consciousness raising, in which everybody has to go to a re-education class run by a new breed of entrepreneurs who are pushing this white fragility narrative. And that is not the same as saying we will not have a colour bar in clubs or in jobs, right? And Windrush is a good example of where the state acted completely in a discriminatory fashion against people who, to all intents and purposes, were citizens of this country. And because they hadn't filled in the paperwork, largely because the state itself was incompetent at organising that, they were then treated like criminals and, like second-class citizens. And we should be outraged by that. That's a very specific instance of I would say, a racist attitude. But not everything is racism. So what I would say to those activists who want to be anti-racist is they've got to decide what it is exactly they're fighting. And if it's statues, or if it's historical revisionism, or if it's simply that you think that you're going to change everybody to agree with you and only agree with certain books and not have another view, I would not call that anti-racism at all. It's a complete betrayal of anti-racism. It's a superficial, glib way of demonstrating your own virtue rather than actually doing anything practical or philosophical at fighting for treating people as equals.
How dangerous do you think these ideas are? Because, you know, you could argue that this is pretty, you know, it hasn't got much impact. You know, if people want to go out and protest, that's fine, you know. However, when, as you say, people take individual cases of racism, because of course, as we all know, racism still exists in society. And when you take the example of Windrush or George Floyd or whatever it is, and then you say every single institution that surrounds us, everyone in positions of power, are racist, and you kind of you extrapolate from one issue to the whole system is corrupt, the whole society is corrupt. And what happens when the whole society is corrupt? You have to tear it down. You've got to tear down the statues, you've got to tear down the institutions, you've got to defund the police. So do you think that this kind of leads to people just simply just tearing down institutions which they believe are institutionally corrupt?
Yeah, I think I think that there's a self-flattery that they're tearing down the institutions. I think it's more likely that the institutions are having a shakeout and putting in place a whole new range of new leaders and new bureaucrats who are going to tell us how to live our lives. So, you know, it's a kind of change of personnel. Some people are going to do very well out of this, by the way. And, you know, if you kind of go along with it. But let's think about how dangerous it is. There have been quite a number of instances now where people have been disciplined or sacked or shamed for querying one narrative. So there is a McCarthyite atmosphere. There is a nervousness about an open discussion, and that is absolutely not healthy. So, you know, the head of a charity in Manchester, which, because I stood as an MEP in the Northwest, I'd heard fantastic things about this great charity, Mancunian Way, and he lost his job because he wrote a blog. Now, he was the founder of the charity. He wrote a blog querying some of the more egregious aspects of Black Lives Matter's ideology. It was absolutely moderate. It wasn't in any way, it wasn't even that. He's panicked, he got sacked. I mean, unbelievable. And that is just one case. I mean, there's lots and lots. Now, how can you say it's healthy to be in a situation where you cannot query an orthodoxy that has literally come into life in 4 weeks? You know, I mean, if you've been following student politics, you might understand the linguistic ways that you're meant to avoid getting no platforms, or, you know all the details of safe spaces, and you have heard all of these kind of stories. But for millions of people in this country, this has come out of nowhere. Out of nowhere, they are basically being told they're racist for no reason other than that they happen to be white. The other dangerous thing when you silence people in that way, and by the way, that slogan, silence is violence, which has come out of the BLM movement, is also frightening because it mandates you that you have to agree. So if you just sort of say, look, sorry, it's not for me, I mean, you are now a racist. That then becomes, so for me, you know, first of all, if people want to go in I've been on the protests, right? I'm anti-racist. I went on those protests, right? Went on 2 protests, and because I wanted to show solidarity. But that's not the same as saying that I should clap at every speech if I think they're talking rubbish. It doesn't mean that I should take the knee because somebody tells me that if I don't take the knee, I'll be shamed. It doesn't mean that I have to say, I absolutely sign up to everything you've said. No, that is very dangerous. And the other thing that you end up with is situations, and this is going to be slightly controversial, but I'll say it. You know, we know what happened in parts of the UK in relation to a silence that emerged around the grooming gangs, because people were frightened to speak out in councils and in places of seniority, because they didn't want people to think that they were being racist about a particular difficulty of particular ethnic groups involved in effectively the sexual, the rape and sexual exploitation of young women. And that was a horrible, difficult issue. And I'm actually nervous about it, because I know that some people on, the far right is a lazy term, but there are people who've exploited that issue. We know that to make racist points and to whip up hysteria around particular ethnicities. But it's also true that we should have tackled those young women were abandoned by the establishment, and you can see this all the time. There was a really interesting interview with a senior police chief, a former senior police chief, who made the point that, and I think this is absolutely spot on, that if you get a situation where the police are nervous to intervene or teachers are nervous to intervene in case you're actually patronising, intervene to, maybe if you're a teacher, to tell off or discipline a young black girl in your class, as a teacher, if you are frightened to do that in case somebody calls you a racist, what that means is that you condescend them and actually you treat them differently by actually keeping out of it, right? And this means that actually you're not treating everybody equally, but it also means that you're then depriving people of interventions that might be necessary, because if somebody is behaving badly, whether they're white or black, whether they're Chinese, whether they're Asian, whether they're, white English, whatever they are, there should be one rule and you treat everyone the same. And that is the same with, of course, the law and the way the police behave. But the police have obviously backed off because they're nervous and anxious. They don't want the hassle of being called racist. That's in this country. That is actually a new form of kind of racial discrimination, where you don't treat everybody as equals under the law or under the rules of any institution. And I do think that's very dangerous for society.
There's some interesting comparisons, and I want to get your thoughts on whether you think these are fair comparisons that I'm just about to make. The ideology that you've just described, and the place that they come from, has these ideas that attack the idea of the individual. They group people together. They have this collective sense of guilt for your past, your ancestors. The consequences of your ancestors' actions are somehow your fault. The idea of white privilege, white guilt, and things like that. And then they say, well, if you're not on my side, because my cause is so virtuous and so morally superior, I am anti-racist. Therefore, if you're not on my side, as you say, silence is violence. Or they say, you are a racist, or you're a bigot, or you're a xenophobe, or whatever it is. And all of these things just make me think, well, the radical ideologies of the last century all had elements of these ideas, the ideas of collectivism, the idea that the sins of your ancestors should be brought out and sort of punished upon you, the idea that if you disagree with what the ideology says, or what the kind of the ideas say, then you are evil and must be punished and must be sacked and must be there must be terrible consequences for you. So can you see these kind of similarities between the radical ideologies of the 20th century and the new woke movement?
Yeah, there are definitely some. You've got to remember that I'm not opposed to collectivism. I know that it's a very odd word, but I want people to form collective movements. I think that individuals all got together, the majority of them, and fought against the overturning, for example, of the Brexit vote. That was a collective. Not all collectives are kind of.
What I mean, can I be more
blobs.
specific? Can I be more specific? Yeah. What I mean is judging people on a characteristic that is part of a collective.
Of course.
That's the kind of idea that I'm trying to say.
No, I know, and that's exactly right. So I just wanted to clarify,
Sure.
because I think that's exactly right, which is if you see people as an undifferentiated blob, all Leave voters were not the same, or Remain voters were not the same, as it were, and it was that infuriating way in the modern period. I mean, modern period, like until about a week ago, was still going on, where everybody said all Leave voters are racist, or, you know, it was also, it has to be said on our side, a bit annoying to say all Remain voters are kind of, you know, what did we say, metropolitan elite, you know, don't get it, snobby or whatever, right? These things are unhelpful at the best of times. But look, historically, we are in a situation whereby we can all recognize that, you know, the worst and the most egregious aspects of Stalinism had people sent to the gulags and did a lot of that kind of historical rewriting. The Cultural Revolution itself in China, you know, I keep thinking about it, especially because we're looking at the incredible bravery of the young people in Hong Kong today, who, despite the most authoritarian and draconian piece of legislation ever introduced in the modern period, I think, by any major state, says that if you go on that demonstration, that you will get a minimum of 10 years. And they've still gone out. I mean, I don't think I'd have the courage, right? I mean, that's a lesson for our woke activists. I mean, you want to know what a fight is? Fighting for freedom where you really put yourself on the line. That's what the kind of, you know, difference. That's what people did, by the way, historically, to overturn racial laws in America, explicitly racist laws, or the Bristol bus boycott, where people actually said, "This is we know we're gonna risk everything for this." But what we've seen in the Cultural Revolution China moment, and that's why I was just reminded of it, is that where young people were encouraged by the state effectively to denounce their elders, to denounce the past. It was a complete year zero approach. And that, of course, is and people should read about that period. It also is like McCarthyism in America. So it's not a left-right thing, because McCarthyism was the attempt at labeling everybody who disagreed a communist, which at the time would then destroy your reputation, your life. So that was kind of, as it were, from the right. There's basically been attempts at silencing people and effectively cleansing society of the wrong ideas on all sides in the 20th century that have been, I mean, I'm trying to avoid mentioning, you know, Germany, but one shouldn't forget that that is the place that made a collective group of people responsible and guilty, and was, you know, obviously the death camps and so on. I just don't want to over exaggerate things, because everybody talks about 1930s and Nazis all the time. But yeah, there are very scary aspects of this. There are very scary ways that people are denied their autonomy and their agency, and told that, you know, they are told that skin color is destiny, effectively. And that is a racist proposition. I mean, that is what we were all opposed to, right? And it also misses any nuance. And one of the things I'm bemused about, I'm not a great kind of every statue must stay, I support all statues person. I am perfectly willing to say, oh, there could be a debate, you know, with that statue's, what's it doing there? Let's put a different one up. That's fine. I you know, that's all right. I mean, I can live with that. But it's a nihilistic destruction of historical memory that I'm most opposed to. And what is amusing but utterly depressing is that there is very little historical discussion that's come out of this statue toppling, you know, because we should be talking about the Cultural Revolution in China. We should be talking about McCarthy. You know, why do you only have to talk about one bit of history? Can't we talk about other bits of history? Can't we recognize the complexities of history? That all sorts of things happened, and the images of those old self-taught historian guys defending the Lincoln statue, which was paid for by freed slaves, and these historians who do tours around Washington having to explain to this baying, screaming mob who are trying to take the Lincoln statue down, they're trying to say, but your ancestors put this up. You know, as it happens, it's not their ancestors, because a lot of them are white. But anyway, not the point. The point they're saying is, it is not in honor of the slaves that you pull this down, because it was slaves who were freed who put it up. You know your history, but they don't. So, you know, what could be, as they call it, what is it, a teaching moment or a learning moment? I mean, fine, let's have a conversation about slavery. I'm also of the opinion that the history curriculum could be shaken up. That's fine. But what you do not want is ahistoric history teaching in schools. You want to have a sense of history, and that requires you to understand the empire in order to understand and all aspects of it and what it was about and so on and so forth, and for you to understand colonialism in that context. Just saying decolonizes the curriculum and don't discuss empire makes no sense. I mean, you have to, and it's not a moral story for you to tell tales on. It's historical periods. Do you understand them? Then you as a grown-up can go off with that knowledge that you've been given in schools and so on and work out whether you're a pro or anti-colonialist. That would be the kind of thing, you know, but let's find out what actually happened. So yes, sorry, there's just one of the sides that I wanted to say is I do fear that people are being forced into, you know, that this is working, or rather the divisions. And so you will hear people say, and I think that this is true, that if you make people overly preoccupied with whether they're white or black, and you have this kind of completely ridiculous notion of a collective that you also, you know, the collectivization says that all POC or BAME, I mean, oh, horrible phrases, people of color or black and minority ethnic people, I mean, God, just the saying of it sounds so awful, are all the same. You know what I mean? They are all the same. They are an undifferentiated blob, and all white people are the same, an undifferentiated blob. What you do, and people have said this informally a lot, but I think it's very important, is that they then say that they become far too self-conscious in terms of what used to be known as race relations, you know, that they never even thought about it. They live in housing estates or in communities where they have neighbours and friends and colleagues from all different ethnicities, and they don't self-consciously think about it. If society demands that you think about it, you become awkward with people. Everybody starts to get awkward with everyone else. You know, you no longer see them as your mate who you tease and joke around with. You're suddenly like, oh my God, will they think I'm a racist? You know, do I have to do something to prove that I'm not a racist? I mean, it becomes a sort of walking on eggshells moment. It's the very opposite of a society that actually treats everybody as an individual with respect. And where we're, or not even with respect, but, you know, as individuals, and you earn that respect or you don't, but, you know, it's not a given, any of these things. And so I do think that people are being divided off from each other, becoming very self-conscious. That's very dangerous, toxic. And we know there's a toxic mood out there at the moment. It's unpleasant.
I want to ask about the idea of white privilege, and it seems to me this idea that there's more differences between groups than within groups has become prevalent. You know, myself as a white person and you as a white person, we have had completely different lives, have completely different views on various things. You know, the fact that we share a skin colour, for me, doesn't really mean anything. So, do you have white privilege?
No, I no, but of course, I understand that. So just to use an example, when my parents moved to to Britain from Ireland, they were shocked when there was signs up. You know, they moved to Manchester and they faced those now infamous signs of, you know, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, right? And it was the first time that they'd ever felt, you know, that because they were Irish, you know, that as immigrants at the time, I mean, it was like, oh my God, you know, they don't, what do you mean they don't? And then they became very self-conscious about their accent and so on. So I do understand that historically, if you're in a group that other people have othered and treated as a group, do you know what I mean? Because you turned up in a wave of Windrush immigration, enthusiastic to come to the UK, and everyone kind of, you know, all those pictures of everybody arrived all enthusiastic, thinking we've come to London, we're gonna, and then everybody treats you like animals, right? Because of your skin colour. That has that impact of making people feel part of a group that they weren't, you know, they might think, well, we don't get on with it. Why are you treating us? So I understand how it happens. That's the point I'm making. And even as a woman, as it were, you know, there are that historically women have been treated as a as second-class citizens historically. And so you can see then that as women, you have an experience that's different. So I'm making the point, I do understand lived experience has an impact, right? It's not as though you can say that all white people know what it feels like to suffer under people saying that you're a second-class citizen because you're black. I mean, that would be ridiculous, right? So I understand that. So in that sense, I've never suffered racism. My parents suffered the anti-Irish racism or bigotry of their day. I didn't. But white privilege doesn't even say that. It says your skin colour itself gives you privileges in society. And you know that that is a nonsense because it takes no account of class, of social difference. It allows people in a situation to, I have been in situations where I've debated at Oxford University, for example, in which I was being lectured about my white privilege by a group of young black students who were very bright. And first of all, they were very privileged because they were at Oxford University, something that was not, it might well have been intellectually out of my reach, but nobody even considered that it was something I should go for. And I had to fight to get to university at all. Never mind, nobody recommended Oxford, but they were there. And in the course of this argument, I was trying to say it's not a question of, I'm putting an intellectual argument forward for universalism. I'm an Enlightenment supporter. I believe that we should have universal principles, that we transcend our skin colour and our identity. They were lecturing me, and afterwards, it didn't go well. And afterwards, somebody said, "Oh, that person there, her father owns half of the country she's from. The other person's father is the CEO of a major bank, and the other one owns oil fields." Right? These were rich. Now, of course, not every black student at Oxford is a highly privileged rich person. That would be equally silly to say. But it was the irony of these very privileged, as in socially wealthy people, saying that they suffered oppression and I didn't know what it felt like. Well, I don't know what it feels like to have a father who owns a bank. That's true. And I don't know what it feels like to have parents who have 6 houses or that's true. So it makes a mockery of the thing. So that's why I think that people react against it. And as a consequence, ordinary people react against it. Then they're told they're racist. And then there are always opportunists on the racist side who will exploit that and try and, stoke up a grievance. So one of the worst reactions we can get into is that white people who haven't ever thought of themselves as white people stoke up their own grievances and start saying, what about white working class boys then? What about this group of white people? What about white poor people? So I'm reluctant to go down that path because it's simply playing the game of identity politics. It overdoes the wrong thing. It overemphasizes the wrong thing. So I don't think there's white privilege, but I don't want to say because there's lots of white poor people. It's just that it's obvious to me that you judge people and explicitly see what social conditions they're in, and class has to be a factor. And there is, it is also the case that if you are an immigrant in this country, sometimes that can mean that you're in a very disadvantageous position. Coming new to a country, you've left everything behind. And if you're an immigrant, you can end up being very poor. So it's not like poor white working class people and all these privileged Asians who are kind of doing very well, which is sometimes the way racists try and pose it. They try and say that, oh, they've been given everything. Thank God. Should go to some parts of, people can live in the worst kind of social environments. And some of the discussion around the lockdown in Leicester, and you look at the conditions in which people are working in garment factories, these people are really having a terrible life, a really hard time. And therefore, I am interested in fighting against social conditions that make people suffer like that, whatever their skin colour.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's that, I suppose that anyone can experience different types of oppression or problems in their lives or Life is pretty horrible for most people, and it has been throughout all of history. But we're lucky enough to live in a society where we're the most prosperous that we've ever been as human beings. So you can view the world through different lenses of oppression to different groups of people, but it's a bit more nuanced than that, because you could say Asian people are oppressed, but what about the guy who, as you say, his dad owns an oil field or whatever it is? So it's kind of like you've got to look at individual cases, haven't you? And we've lost that nuance, haven't we, in society, where we don't look at people through a lot of these things. We don't look at people as individuals. We just simply see the colour of their skin or the class that they came from or whatever it is.
Yeah, but that's what racism was. I mean, I should note that when you are in a situation of historically institutionalized racism, it wouldn't have mattered in America or in Britain whether your dad owned an oil field in the past. If you were black, you'd be treated as though you were nothing, right? That's what racism is, right? That is what racism does, right? It dehumanizes, it removes that nuance. But we made massive strides away from that. And when it happens that somebody is racist, they should be not just called out. If anyone did that, that would be wrong. The problem is the reaction at the moment is emphasizing racial difference. So we're actually doing exactly the point that you're making, is we're losing all the nuance. We're actually treating groups of people as undifferentiated blobs based on their ethnicity. The very kind of racial thinking that anti-racists fought against for all those years. We should never do that. And maybe now I could say, a group of us wrote a statement called "Don't Divide Us," and it was an attempt at which we just published, which was an attempt at saying, if we allow this kind of racial thinking to dominate, we are basically allowing, racists to win the day, because that's their philosophy as well. And we absolutely have to fight against any attempt at saying that the most important differences between us are our skin colours or our ethnicities. We have far more in common with each other than we have as distinct, as against each other.
Do you find that there's a bit of a contradiction, or at least find it odd, that people think that every powerful institution in Britain, America, or the Western world is somehow corrupt and racist, when all of these institutions, the tech companies, the civil service, whatever it is, absolutely support the Black Lives Matter movement to no end?
Well, people have talked about, and it's true, woke capitalism. Never has there been so many. Everybody important in society has bought into this agenda. Some of them are distancing themselves a little bit from Black Lives Matter as an organisation. Everybody wears Black Lives Matters, takes the knee, and so on and so forth. Again, more mandated than choice. If a particular footballer wants to take the knee, that's fine with me. I don't care, right? But you can't mandate everyone's got to do it, otherwise it loses its meaning anyway. But the Premier League goes along with this, says that anyone who disagrees is somehow, letting the side down. All of the things that we've seen. Now it's rather embarrassed because it's worked. Also, so is Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, all rather embarrassing. We didn't mean Black Lives Matters, that one. We meant Black Lives Matters, that one. But you're absolutely right that they've still bought into the overall ideas. It doesn't, even if Black Lives Matters as an organisation disappeared tonight, right? It just completely discredited and got cancelled as everyone else is getting cancelled. If they got cancelled, I'm afraid that the ideas would not get cancelled, because they're already in the institutions brewing away and have now come to the forefront. Everybody important in society now has adopted this. It's an orthodoxy. So it reminds me of something, many years ago, what a lot of companies did in relation to environmentalism was that they were all a bit, you imagine you're running an oil company, don't quite know what to do. Everyone's going on about sustainability and environmental, what should we do? And they all went out and they hired people like ex-environmentalists, or, ex-Greenpeace or ex-whatever to come and work for them. And they set up a department, they gave them a huge amount of money. And the next minute you knew, the company was saying, we're not really an oil company at all. Do you know what I mean? And it kind of grew and grew. It became an industry. Let me tell you, the industry of lecturing people on white fragility is booming, right? And I think it is interesting that author Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the White Fragility book that's now kind of you can't buy because everybody's bought it out, and company bosses are sending it out to their employers, and there's now people set up saying they can give lectures on it. Every university department is mandating all of their staff in their staff development things to sit and listen to people come in and lecture them about how they don't understand how institutionally racist they are. Every teacher has been told they've got to introduce this to young people. Robin DiAngelo, I don't know who wrote that book, is apparently charging $6,000 for an hour lecture. Nice work if you can get it, as they say. And she'll probably end up getting cancelled, by the way, because everyone will see that is an example of white privilege. But that is a white woman lecturing white people on, white fragility. But nonetheless, I think you're absolutely spot on to notice that this is woke capitalism, if anything, it's the fear that I have is the way that every institution is just bought into this, and that's where you start to get the kind of McCarthyism atmosphere. So I know people who work in arts institutions who were reprimanded for not putting up the black square in Instagram. Now, when they worked, so we're all in lockdown. People who work in big music institutions, your bosses aren't meant to tell you what your politics are, by the way. Well, I'm there. Talk about, this is where you need a trade union. For goodness sake, when your bosses tell you that you have to have a particular political outlook, that is not a progressive moment, is it? That is not a moment that one celebrates. That is scary. So my fear about the institutions buying this lock, stock and barrel is the impact it will have in workplaces of anyone who doesn't go along with it. And it feels as though it's not just feels as though people are being told they have to say this in public. So either people will speak in bad faith, by the way, because I know lots of people who nod along. Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. But they don't believe it. So we're encouraging people to be dishonest and to speak in bad faith. And then you drive ideas into the underground. Very bad.
Let's talk about that book very quickly. To be honest, I haven't read it, so it's sort of quite hard for me to form a proper opinion on it. But I've read reviews of it and things like that. So, the kind of ideas it's talking about. For example, the author might say, if you think that you're not racist, then actually you are racist. Or if you think you understand the issues of racism, then you are racist and you could never understand because you're white or whatever. But of course, the author herself, who is white, completely understands, and she's not a racist. But this is the best-selling book, as you say, on the New York Times. And to me, it has some pretty dangerous ideas. To me, it sounds racist to me. The kind of some of the ideas that she's been talking about. So how has this book become such a Bible for the woke movement?
I think it's a coincidence of this book. There's about 5 of them that are sort of doing very well, but this one in particular sort of is a way for people to say, oh, it's written by a white woman, so she understands. Remember, we live in a period of racial thinking, so she as a white woman understands that we whites are guilty. You know what I mean? So it's actually, it almost makes people feel more comfortable that she's sort of saying it than being lectured to by a black person, even though there's books by black writers are also important. But I think you're right. It's the most extreme bonkers example because but what it does that's really terrible is it doesn't talk about white privilege it does, but that's not its main point. It actually goes that step further, which is if you are an active anti-racist and a white, you are the worst kind of person, according to that book, because you really are in denial. So it refutes anybody who's made a political decision to fight bigotry and identifies them as the problem. So it absolutely wipes the slate clean of the ability for anyone to make a political distinction between themselves and somebody who's just kind of wondering about never having thought about it. So, that's very scary. The other thing it does is it promotes the notion of affinity groups. And affinity, this is a phrase that it sounds very therapeutic. But there's a Channel 4 series on how to make an anti-racist school. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but I watched the first one last week. And it's based on the D'Angelo model of affinity groups. affinity groups are basically where you segregate white children and children from BAME backgrounds. You segregate them for periods of time in their affinity group. So they all have to talk about whiteness, or they all have to talk about ethnicity, their ethnicity. So first of all, it does that thing of it puts all BAME people in one room all together as though they're all the same. So that's in and of itself, you know, problematic. But obviously it's vile. And the white kids, they're all, I mean, they don't know what to do. I mean, it's like sort of, oh, what do you say, you know? And then so actually, as it happens in the BAME group, everybody has a bit of a laugh because they're kind of liberated. White kids all look like they're completely cowed because they're obviously like, I mean, it's like being like, and you white proto-fascist types, I mean, they don't say, you know, who are guilty of, I mean, they're awkward. And anyway, D'Angelo promotes affinity groups in workplaces throughout society, which is a form of segregation, of course. I mean, it's a form of, you know, imagine all of those brave activists who fought segregation. You know, think of apartheid. Now, people will say, oh, well, it's not the same. How can you say it's the same? Because that was, but it is true that it is not the same. But there is worrying aspects of people who think that people segregated along racial lines is a positive thing. I mean, to me, it is not. And it means that we will never, I mean, you know, apart from the fact that I'm going to say we'll never understand each other, which immediately shows you how mad it is that I'm even saying it, because the truth of the matter is that that's not the point. And you've got in these affinity groups, you know, kids being dragged away, and it's like, well, but he's my best friend. I want to be in a group with him. Well, you can't, because he's black, you're white, you go over there. And then how can you be good friends then afterwards? It's like this horrible. So it's also something else that's important is it's like a psychological turn. It's like the use of psychology and consciousness raising. Some of the worst aspects that came out of things like the Frankfurt School and the sort of therapy culture is that we're all asked to, you know, internally view ourselves. So whereas political movements historically about leaving yourself behind, transcending yourself, making history by going out and uniting with people to change the world, and through the course of that changing yourself, we're all meant to like look deep into ourselves. Who are you really? And of course it makes you neurotic, it makes you narcissistic, it makes you think the world is about you, and it makes you incredibly self-conscious. So that's it's the most extreme example, but you can see why that book just sums up the worst aspects for me of identity politics, but for other people sums up why the problem is a white problem and the whites should go and sort themselves out, which is what D'Angelo offers to do for you.
It's truly astonishing. I mean, listening to that, I mean, I'm slightly taken aback at the whole idea that you somehow segregation is now a good thing if it's against white people. I mean, I just can't. I don't know. It does make me you know, surprised just hearing that idea, and that is now, you know, in some senses a mainstream idea. I know there's a video on Twitter of people segregating a black only area at a white at this one of these protests. I get the feeling that, you know, I'm probably a bit entrenched in this. I read up on, you know, what's going on and all these individual cases of wokeness and the people getting cancelled and everything like that. And I think a lot of people watching this video might think that there's this, you know, this is something really significant and huge, and they might get very worried about it and agitated and angry and upset because a lot of these issues are very emotional. Is there a danger of us taking this a bit too seriously and thinking that this, you know, this is the end of days and, you know, our society is collapsing? Is that taking it too far, or should we take it really seriously? And is this really dangerous?
Yeah. So I wrote just a really short book a few years ago called "I Find That Offensive," and actually it was about all of these trends. That was what I was trying to write about. And I was a bit guilty because I was looking at what was happening in America, and I was trying to use it as a warning about what would happen here. And you know, I didn't, you know, because there's always a danger that you can amplify trends by writing about them. So I was trying to use it as a warning. A bit of me was thinking, I don't want people to get the idea that we should do this, but I could see the trends, so I was trying to take them up. And a lot of people said at the time, and anyone who's been involved in critiquing student politics and some of these more identity politics things over recent years there's always a kind of group of critics who say, oh, for God's sake, you know, it's just these people using it to, you know, to scaremonger, you know, and a lot of students grow out of it anyway, and they're exaggerating it, and there's straw men, or, you know, all of this kind of thing. But actually, I always knew that this was going to explode on this thing, just didn't know how. I mean, it has been eating away at the heart of society. So is it end of days? And I think what's happened now, I think I mentioned earlier, is that now people who maybe have not been following this have suddenly seen what it's really like. I mean, it's always been grim in those areas where it's taken off, like student situations. But, you know, why would you, you know, a lot of people don't follow what's happening around the Rhodes Must Fall statues or what's happening in American campuses. Like, you know, they're like safe spaces. What are they? I don't understand, right? I don't understand you can be cancelled for using the language that gets you called a TERF, and they don't know what a TERF is. I mean, they're kind of like, what is going on? But if you think about the way this has exploded in relation to the trans issue around J.K. Rowling, who is a very popular writer, so a lot more people now know about that issue because of that, and because of what's happened. But as I say, partly because we're in lockdown, so in a way there's this intensified mood, this weird atmosphere anyway, that society's not being normal. It means that there's now a popular appreciation of that, what's going on. Yeah, so there's that side to it. It also means that, you know, employers can get away with a lot of this stuff. I mean, I'm not being, but, you know, you can be on your Zoom meeting with your boss saying you've all got to read D'Angelo when you've all got to go to affinity groups. And it's not the same as kind of when you can then go for a pint with your fellow colleagues at work and say, we're just going to not put up with this, are we? Because you're kind of, you listen to the lecture and you kind of turn it off and you don't say anything because you frightened you get sacked. So in some ways, it's distorted by the mood that we're in. So I don't think it's the end of days, but I do think it's serious. And I don't think that, I'm disappointed that more politicians haven't taken this up and made more of a public announcement. You know, Boris Johnson yesterday in his Rooseveltian, you know, New Deal speech, which was, you know, an impressive speech in its own ways, if he does half of it, sort of thing. But you know, he sort of said, and we're not tumbling you know, we're not pulling down statues. And that's it. And then you've kind of got, you know, a kind of Home Secretary who thinks that the way to deal with it is to say, well, you'll get 10 years if you pull down the statue. And neither of those two responses seems adequate to me, because I think you have to break open the discussion, which is why we did this Don't Divide Us initiative. We need to be able to talk about it much more. I mean, I'm not necessarily right, and maybe I'm exaggerating things, but unless you have an open discussion, you can't change the whole way that workplaces, schools, universities, and the whole of what's established happen. Every institution now takes the knee, and we're all meant to just go along with it. You've at least got to talk about that, right? Every institution is now making announcements that they're fundamentally shifting the way they operate. Well, that in a democracy requires a discussion. It's not something you can just pronounce without anyone being allowed to query it or challenge it. And I think that in that sense, it's important to not underestimate it. That's why I keep saying, you know, I've got some mates who sort of think, oh, it's just Black Lives Matters, and if we expose that particular organisation and everyone's looking at funding and there's all this discussion, you know, it'll all go away. I think that just underestimates it. You've got other people who say to me, oh, Chloe, you're making a fuss about nothing, what's wrong? I think you said it, Stephen, you know, a lot of young people going on a demo for the first time and wanting to go, you know, on an anti-racist demo and don't like police brutality in America, which, by the way, America is different to the UK, and there is a lot more police brutality in America, and there is more racism in America for historic reasons. That is all true, even though not as simplified as the way Black Lives Matter activists will tell you. But, you know, what's wrong with people sort of suddenly becoming aware of the racism of the criminal justice system in America? There's nothing wrong with it. But again, that underestimates, I think, the widespread wholesale reorganization of institutions around some of the identity politics trends. So that doesn't mean it's the end of days. But like everything, if you don't put up an intellectual fight, it means that you will find that you have no freedom to debate or discuss it. And I think we'll see a lot more people losing their livelihoods and being shamed and so on and so forth. And for a long time in recent years, we've seen how racism has been deployed as a silencing mechanism, as a way of delegitimizing people and discrediting them, because we know that it was one of the most successful ways of treating those people who happen to vote in a legitimate government called referendum to leave the European Union. Never did it dawn on people when they did that they would be described as racist scum, knuckle draggers with xenophobic attitudes. And so racism itself as an accusation has become devalued. It's become, it's become confused and used promiscuously. It doesn't have the same purchase. And now we have another layer added on. And the danger there is that where there is real racism, you can't even spot it. You don't even get to a point where, there's a kind of cry wolf aspect to it. And so I think in the same way that quite a lot of people kicked back and reacted, and eventually, I think, had some success in showing that people who voted quite straightforwardly to leave the European Union weren't racist. I think it's very important that people kick back against this denunciation of the majority of people in British society is racist, because one of the things which we haven't mentioned is the majority of people who live in the UK are white. This is not like some conspiratorial plan against ethnic minorities. It's just a reality of the society that we live in. And in fact, it's a very rich, ethnically mixed society, partly because of previous empire that led to the Commonwealth, which we know had some bad things, lots of bad things. But as a consequence, it's a very nice, wonderful international country. We've always had that. It's been one of the most, it's one of the great things about the UK. And there's all sorts of people who live here. But they're obviously a minority of people because it is predominantly a white country. That does not, and immediately as you say that, it's like as though you're admitting you're kind of like a Ku Klux Klan member or something. You know what I mean? It just happens that the majority of people are white. But you can't almost say that. So if you're organising a panel discussion or something, it's kind of like, it's not representative. But it is actually. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to get into percentages because I don't like representative, but it's just this notion that there's something embarrassing about the fact that the majority of people of a particular country are white is as ridiculous as, going to Nigeria and saying, I think this is absolutely outrageous. You've just got this majority of Nigerian black people there. I mean, where are the whites? I mean, where are they? I mean, obviously it's ridiculous, right? That is what it's like. You go to Shanghai, you can't wander around and go, I can't believe in Shanghai that there are not a majority of black Africans teaching in universities, or why aren't there more American white people? I mean, these things are ignoring historic matters. And as it happens, it's not of any interest. They just teach geographical historic matters, and we should judge people on the character of and what's in their heart and what's in their minds rather than their skin colour.
And on that thought, thank you so much, Claire Fox, for joining us.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you, Steve.